She lay on the shoulder of the busiest highway in Seattle, trembling in the freezing fog. Her eyes were duct-taped shut. Her legs were bound with industrial zip ties. But she wasn't trying to escape. She was using her own body as a living shield to protect the tiny, dying puppy tucked against her belly. She couldn't see the 18-wheelers roaring past just inches from her nose. She could only hear the sound of death approaching. She was left there to be obliterated, erased by the morning rush hour, but she refused to move. Thousands of drivers passed her by until one man, a grieving Marine with nothing left to lose, saw what no one else did. He didn't just find a dog that day. He found a soldier holding the line. What happened next will break your heart, and then piece it back together stronger than before. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe that no act of loyalty should ever go unrewarded, hit that subscribe button, because this story might just be the most beautiful thing you hear all year. The fog in Seattle doesn't just obscure the world, it swallows it whole. It was a thick, wet blanket of gray that rolled off the Puget Sound, choking the morning light and turning the Interstate 5 corridor into a claustrophobic tunnel of concrete and exhaust. The city skyline was gone, erased by the mist, leaving only the wet slick of the tarmac and the rhythmic, terrifying whoosh of 18-wheelers cutting through the gloom like invisible leviathans. Elias Thorne gripped the steering wheel of his battered 2008 Ford F-150 with knuckles that turned white under the strain. He was a man built of hard angles and weathered stone, 55 years old, with hair the color of steel wool and a face etched with the kind of deep lines that come from seeing too much of the world's ugliness. He wore a faded flannel jacket that had seen better decades, and his eyes, usually sharp and assessing, were today clouded with a distant, heavy sorrow. "Visibility is near zero, Sarah," Elias murmured, his voice rough like gravel grinding together. He glanced at the empty passenger seat beside him. There was no one there, just a crumpled receipt from a hardware store and a travel mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "You always hated driving in this soup. You'd be gripping the door handle right now, telling me to slow down even though we're barely doing 40. He waited for a beat, a habit he couldn't break, as if expecting her laugh to cut through the hum of the engine, but the cab remained silent. It was the 3rd anniversary of her passing, and the silence had grown heavier with each year, settling into the upholstery like dust. Elias was heading north toward the evergreen Washelli Memorial Park. He had a bundle of white lilies in the back, wrapped in plastic. Sarah loved lilies. She said they looked like trumpets announcing good news. Elias didn't feel like there was any good news left to announce, but he made the drive anyway. It was his duty. A Marine never abandons his post, even if that post is a grave marker in the rain. The traffic on the I-5 was a nightmare of red brake lights blooming suddenly in the gray mist and then vanishing just as quickly. Huge cargo trucks, hauling timber and steel from the ports, roared past in the center lanes, displacing enough air to shake Elias's heavy truck. He stayed in the slow lane, his eyes scanning the shoulder out of ingrained discipline. In the corps, you learn that the threat you don't see is the one that kills you. Even in retirement, Elias scanned sectors. That was when he saw it. At first, it looked like a tire tread, the kind of shredded rubber debris that litters highways everywhere. But as his headlights cut a brief swath through a break in the fog, the shape seemed too solid, too high. Then it moved. It was a subtle shift, a flinch, but Elias saw it. "What in the hell?" he muttered. He checked his mirrors, a reflex faster than thought, and saw a gap in the traffic behind him. He didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy truck onto the emergency shoulder, the tires crunching loudly over loose gravel and wet debris. He slammed the gear shift into park and hit the hazard lights. The rhythmic click-clack of the flashers was the only orderly sound in the chaotic morning. Elias opened the door, and the roar of the highway assaulted him. The air smelled of wet pine needles, diesel fumes, and ozone. He stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He was a big man, 6'2", with the broad shoulders of someone who had carried heavy packs for half his life, though now they slumped slightly under an invisible weight. He walked forward, squinting against the stinging mist. 10 yards ahead of his truck, nestled dangerously close to the white line that separated life from death, lay 2 dark shapes. As Elias got closer, his breath hitched in his throat. The rage that flared in his chest was so sudden and so hot, it almost brought him to his knees. It was a German shepherd. She was lying flat on her belly, in the wet grime of the breakdown lane. She was emaciated, her ribs visible, even through her matted, muddy fur. But it wasn't her condition that stopped Elias's heart. It was her position. She was curled in a tight C shape, her body forming a desperate, living shield around a small, trembling ball of fur tucked against her belly. A puppy, and they were trapped. Elias took a step closer, and the reality of the scene came into sharp, horrifying focus. The mother dog's hind legs were bound together with thick industrial zip ties. But worse, far worse, was her face. Thick black duct tape was wrapped cruelly around her eyes, blinding her. She couldn't see the cars. She couldn't see the monstrous semi-trucks thundering past just feet from her nose. She could only hear them. The puppy, a tiny thing no bigger than a loaf of bread, was also blindfolded. "Oh, God," Elias whispered. The prayer fell from his lips before he could stop it. A massive logging truck roared past in the right lane. The gust of wind it created was violent, a wall of air that slammed into Elias, whipping his jacket. The mother dog didn't run. She couldn't run, but she didn't thrash either. At the roar of the truck, she simply pressed herself harder into the pavement, flattening her body over the puppy. She flinched, a violent shudder running through her spine, but she held her ground. She was terrified, blind and defenseless, yet she refused to abandon the terrifying darkness if it meant exposing her child. Elias felt a tear in his own soul. He recognized that posture. He had seen Marines throw themselves on grenades. He had seen fathers shield children from falling rubble. It was the universal geometry of sacrificial love. "Hold on," Elias said, his voice dropping into the command register he hadn't used in years. "Hold on, Mama. I've got you." He knew he couldn't just grab them. A terrified, blind dog was a loaded weapon. If she panicked and bolted, she would go straight into the wheels of a truck. He needed to secure the perimeter. Elias ran back to his truck, his bad knee protesting the sudden sprint. He didn't go for the first aid kit yet. He reached under the back seat and pulled out a case of road flares. He ripped the cap off a flare and struck it. The chemical hiss was sharp, and a brilliant, magnesium-red light erupted, cutting through the gray fog like a lightsaber. He walked boldly into the right lane of the interstate. He didn't wave his arms frantically. He stood tall, the red fire in his hand extended, his posture rigid and unyielding. He was no longer a grieving widower on his way to a cemetery. He was Staff Sergeant Thorne, and he was taking control of this sector. Cars screeched, horns blared, a sedan swerved, tires singing on the wet asphalt. Elias didn't flinch. He walked the flare back 50 yards, forcing the traffic to merge left, creating a pocket of safety, a sanctuary of silence around the two dogs. He dropped the first flare, then struck a second one and placed it closer to the animals. The red glow illuminated the terror on the dog's face. Her ears were swiveling frantically, trying to make sense of the new sounds. The boots, the hissing fire, the screeching brakes. Elias approached her slowly, keeping his body low. He could see the tension in her muscles. She bared her teeth, a low, rumbling growl emanating from her chest. It wasn't the growl of a predator. It was the warning of a mother backed into a corner. "Easy," Elias crooned. He stopped 5 feet away. The wind whipped his silver hair across his eyes. "I know you can't see me. I know you're scared. But the cavalry is here, sweetheart. The cavalry is here." The puppy whimpered, a high-pitched sound of pure distress. The mother nudged it with her nose, blindly checking if it was still there, still safe. Elias looked at the duct tape matting her fur. He looked at the zip ties cutting into her legs. Someone had done this. Someone had taken the time to bind them, blind them, and dump them on the busiest highway in Washington state, leaving them to be obliterated by the morning rush hour. For a moment, the red haze of the flare seemed to match the red haze in Elias's mind. He wanted to find whoever did this. He wanted to visit violence upon them, but the dog whined again, a sound of utter exhaustion. Elias pushed the anger down. Anger wouldn't save them. Calm would. "I'm coming in," Elias said softly, broadcasting his movements with his voice. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to take the dark away." He took a step. The mother dog snapped her jaws at the air, missing his hand by inches. She was fighting a ghost war, biting at enemies she couldn't see. Elias froze. He didn't pull back. He stayed in the pocket. "That's it," he whispered, impressed despite the danger. "You're a warrior. I see you. You did good, Mama. You held the line. He sank to his knees on the wet gravel, ignoring the cold water soaking through his jeans. He was inches from her now. He could smell the fear on her, a sour, metallic scent mixed with the damp dog smell. "I'm Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the traffic noise, "and we are going to get out of here, but you have to trust me." He reached out his hand, palm open, and let it hover near her nose, just below the line of the tape. He waited. The mother dog froze. Her nose twitched. She inhaled, taking in the scent of coffee, old flannel, and gunpowder from the flare. She didn't bite. She let out a long, shuddering breath, and for the first time since he spotted her, her head drooped slightly. She was running on fumes, kept alive only by adrenaline and love. Elias moved his hand slowly to her neck. Her fur was cold and soaked. "I've got you," he whispered, tears mixing with the mist on his feet. "I've got you." The highway was a river of noise, but inside the small bubble of red flare light, the world had narrowed down to 3 breathing creatures: a man, a mother, and a dying child. Elias Thorne moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had cleared buildings in Fallujah. He didn't rush. Rushing made mistakes, and mistakes got you killed. He unlatched the tailgate of his Ford F-150, the metal groaning in protest against the damp morning air. The bed of the truck was cold, covered in a black rubber liner that smelled of oil and pine resin. It wasn't a soft place, but it was safer than the asphalt. He returned to the dogs. The mother, the German shepherd whose ribs he could count through her wet fur, was vibrating with tension. She could smell him, hear him, but the darkness taped over her eyes turned every sound into a threat. "All right, Mama," Elias murmured, keeping his voice in the lower register, a rumble that vibrated in his own chest. "We're moving out. Don't fight me." He reached for the puppy first. It was the tactical choice. Move the high-value asset, and the protector will follow. But as his hands brushed the puppy's fur, the mother exploded. She didn't bark. It was a snap of jaws, a violent guttural warning that slashed through the air inches from Elias's wrist. Blind and bound, she lunged, her body twisting awkwardly on the wet pavement. She was ready to tear him apart to keep him away from her young. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He knew that pulling back triggered the chase instinct. Instead, he leaned in closer, invading her space, his presence overlapping hers. "Stand down, Marine," he ordered. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of 20 years of command. It was the voice that stopped panic in a foxhole. It was steel wrapped in velvet. "Stand down," he repeated, softer this time. "I'm taking you home." The dog froze. The tone registered. It was a language that transcended species, the sound of authority and safety. Her ears swiveled forward, listening to the cadence of his breath. She lowered her head, surrendering the perimeter. Elias scooped the puppy up. It was terrifyingly light, like holding a bundle of dry twigs wrapped in damp wool. He placed the small creature on the passenger seat of his truck, wrapping it in the old woolen blanket Sarah used to keep there for picnics. Then he went back for the mother. She was heavy, dead weight, her muscles locked in fear. He slid his arms under her belly and chest, ignoring the mud soaking into his flannel jacket. He grunted as he lifted her, his bad knee flaring with a sharp, familiar pain. He carried her not to the bed of the truck, but to the cab. He couldn't leave her exposed in the back, not like this. He maneuvered her onto the floorboard of the passenger side, right beneath the puppy. "There!" he huffed, slamming the door shut, sealing out the roar of the I-5. "Secure!" He climbed into the driver's seat, his heart hammering, a rhythm against his ribs that he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked at them. The mother was curled on the floor mats, her nose pressed against the seat fabric, inhaling the scent of her pup. The puppy was a lump under the plaid blanket. "I need names," Elias said to the empty air, starting the engine. The heater blasted to life, blowing hot, stale air into the cab. "Can't have you dying as Jane does." He looked at the mother, at the fierce, blind loyalty etched into her posture. She was a warrior who chose who lived and who died. "Valkyrie," he said, "that's you, chooser of the slain. You chose him to live." He glanced at the small lump on the seat. "And you're on point. You're the reason she's fighting. Scout." Elias merged back onto the highway, the F-150 groaning as he pushed it to 70. He needed to get to the emergency vet clinic in downtown Seattle, 20 miles south. The cab warmed up quickly. The smell of wet dog and old coffee filled the small space. Elias kept checking the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but to watch the rise and fall of the blanket on the passenger seat. Valkyrie had settled down, her head resting on her paws, though her ears remained radar dishes, tracking every shift in the truck's vibration. But Scout was too quiet. 10 minutes into the drive, the traffic thinned slightly as the fog began to lift, revealing the skeletal gray trees lining the interstate. Elias glanced over. The blanket wasn't moving. "Scout?" he asked. No movement, no tiny whimper. Elias reached over with his right hand, keeping his left on the wheel. He pulled back the corner of the blanket. The puppy was limp, his head lolled to the side, the tongue hanging out, pale and dry. The heat in the car was stifling, but the puppy felt cold. Elias looked at the small chest. Still. "No," Elias whispered. The word tasted like ash. "No, you don't. Not on my watch." He checked the mirror. A semi-truck was bearing down on him in the right lane. Elias didn't care. He slapped the hazard lights back on and wrenched the wheel to the right. The truck tires screamed in protest as he skidded onto the gravel shoulder, kicking up a cloud of dust and rocks. Valkyrie yelped as the truck shuddered to a halt, scrambling blindly on the floorboard. "Stay!" Elias shouted, throwing the door open. He grabbed the puppy. It felt like holding a rag doll. There was no resistance, no tension, just the terrible, heavy limpness of a life slipping away. Elias jumped out of the truck. The air outside was biting cold, a sharp contrast to the heater, but he needed a flat surface. He slammed the puppy down onto the hood of the truck. The metal was warm from the engine, vibrating slightly. "Come on, Scout," Elias growled. He ripped the duct tape off the puppy's eyes. He didn't have time to be gentle. Fur came with it, but the puppy didn't even flinch. The eyes underneath were rolled back, showing only the whites. Elias placed his large, calloused hands on the tiny rib cage. It was so fragile. One wrong push and he would crush the bones like bird wings. He had performed CPR on grown men, on Marines wearing Kevlar, pressing down with all his strength to restart a heart stopped by shock or blood loss. But this required a surgeon's touch with a blacksmith's hands. 1, 2, 3. He pressed down with his thumbs. Compress, compress, compress. "Breathe, damn you!" Elias hissed through clenched teeth. He leaned down, covering the puppy's entire snout with his mouth. He exhaled, a short, sharp puff of air. He watched the tiny chest rise artificially, inflated by his own breath. He pulled back. Nothing. The chest fell and stayed down. Valkyrie was barking now inside the truck, a frantic, muffled sound. She could smell the distress. She knew her boy was gone. "I said stand down!" Elias yelled at the windshield, not looking up. He went back to the compressions. The wind from the passing cars whipped his hair into his eyes. He didn't feel the cold. He felt the ghost of every soldier he couldn't save standing behind him, watching. He felt Sarah watching. "You're just an old man with a dead dog on the side of the road," a voice in his head whispered. "It's over. Let it go." "Shut up," Elias grunted. 1, 2, 3. He pressed harder. He felt a rib crack, a sickening pop. He didn't stop. Better a broken rib than a dead dog. He gave another breath. The taste of dirt and old fur filled his mouth. A minute passed. 2. It felt like an hour. The puppy was cooling rapidly under his hands. Elias stopped. He stared at the small, broken thing on his hood. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving him hollow. "Don't you do this," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't you make her sacrifice for nothing." He brought his fist down, not a punch, but a sharp thud right over the heart. A precordial thump, a Hail Mary. Thump, and then a gasp. It was a terrible wet sound, like a drowning man breaking the surface. The puppy's body jerked. A cough racked the tiny frame, and then another. A shallow, ragged breath drew in, rattling in the small throat. Elias slumped against the grill of the truck, his forehead resting on the warm metal hood. He sucked in a breath of cold air, his eyes squeezing shut. "Attaboy," he whispered. "Attaboy. Scout." He scooped the puppy up again, tucking him inside his flannel jacket, right against his chest, skin to skin. He could feel the weak, fluttering heartbeat against his own sternum. It was erratic, thready, but it was there. He opened the truck door. Valkyrie was pressing herself against the dashboard, whining, her nose working furiously. "He's here," Elias told her, his voice exhausted. "He's here, Valkyrie." He sat in the driver's seat, keeping Scout tucked inside his jacket with one hand, steering with the other. He didn't put the puppy back on the seat. He needed to feel that heartbeat. He needed to know it was still there. He put the truck in gear and floored it. The F-150 roared, the tires spinning on the gravel before catching traction. Elias didn't look at the speedometer. He didn't look at the fog. He looked at the road ahead, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. They were going to make it. They had to. Because if they didn't, Elias wasn't sure he could survive the silence of the drive home alone. The doors of the Seattle Emergency Veterinary Center slid open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded too much like a ventilator. Elias Thorne burst through them, a man possessed, carrying a bundle tucked inside his flannel jacket, like a contraband heart. "I need help!" His voice cracked, booming off the sterile white walls. "Now!" The reception area was quiet, populated only by a woman with a sneezing cat and an elderly man clutching a hamster cage. They stared. Elias didn't care. He looked like a wreck. Mud on his jeans, blood on his hands from where he'd scraped his knuckles during CPR, and a wild, desperate fire in his eyes. Dr. Sarah Miller appeared from the back almost instantly. She was a woman in her early 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes framed by purple-rimmed glasses and hair pulled back in a messy bun that suggested she hadn't slept in 24 hours. She wore navy blue scrubs covered in paw prints, but her demeanor was pure triage surgeon. "Trauma?" she asked, already motioning for a tech to bring a gurney. "Puppy. Stopped breathing. I got him back, but he's weak," Elias rasped, pulling Scout from his jacket. "And the mother. She's in the truck. Blindfolded. Bound." Sarah's face hardened. She didn't ask questions. She pointed to the tech. "Get the puppy into the incubator. Oxygen and fluids stat. Sir, bring the mother in. Side entrance, go." The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Elias moved Valkyrie into the exam room, lifting her onto the steel table. She was exhausted. Her adrenaline crashed, leaving her shivering and compliant. When Sarah cut the zip ties from her legs, the skin underneath was raw and weeping. When she peeled the remaining adhesive from Valkyrie's face, taking care not to rip the eyelids, Elias had to look away. But it was later, after Scout was stabilized in the ICU, that the real horror revealed itself. Elias stood in the corner of exam room 2, arms crossed tight over his chest, watching Sarah work on Valkyrie. The dog was sedated now, sleeping deeply for the first time in God knows how long. Sarah had shaved patches of the German Shepherd's matted fur to treat the wounds. The buzzing of the clippers stopped. The room fell silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. "Elias," Sarah said softly. She didn't look up. "Come look at this." Elias stepped forward. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Valkyrie's skin was a roadmap of agony. "These aren't from the highway," Sarah said, tracing a jagged white line along the dog's flank with a gloved finger. "This is an old bite mark. Deep, healed badly. And here." She pointed to a cluster of circular scars on her shoulder. "Cigarette burns." Elias felt his jaw tightens until his teeth ached. "Who does this?" "It gets worse," Sarah said, her voice devoid of emotion, the professional detachment of someone trying not to scream. She rolled the dog slightly to expose her belly. "Look at her mammary glands. Swollen, stretched. And this scar here, a C-section, a hasty one, probably done with a knife and fishing line, judging by the keloid tissue." She looked at Elias, her eyes burning with a mixture of fatigue and fury. "I've seen this before. She's a breeder bitch, a puppy mill product." Elias stared at the sleeping dog. "A mill? She's maybe 4 years old, Elias. But judging by the wear on her body, she's birthed at least 6 litters, probably 3 in the last 18 months alone." "That's not possible," Elias said. "Dogs don't cycle that fast." "They do if you pump them full of hormones," Sarah spat, throwing the used gauze into the bin with violent force. "They inject them to force heat cycles. They induce labor early to get the puppies out and sell them, then breed her again immediately. They don't let her rest. They don't let her heal. She's just a machine to them, a machine that prints money until it breaks." Elias looked at Valkyrie. He saw the majestic head, the noble snout, the strength inherent in her frame. They had turned a warrior into a factory. And when she broke, Elias said, his voice low, they threw her away. She's malnourished, dehydrated, and her calcium levels are critically low from nursing, Sarah listed. That's why she couldn't run. She literally gave pieces of herself to keep that puppy alive. Elias reached out and rested his hand on Valkyrie's head, careful not to touch the sores. "She's retired now," he whispered. "Your watch is over, girl." By midnight, the clinic had quieted down. The frantic energy of the day had settled into the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Sarah had offered to call Elias a cab, suggesting he go home and sleep. He refused. He told her he lived 40 miles north and didn't want to drive the truck in the dark. It was a lie. He just couldn't leave them. The silence of his empty house was too loud tonight. Sarah, sensing the immovable object that was Elias Thorne, gave him a pillow and a blanket and pointed him toward the waiting room chairs. But Elias couldn't sleep. The PTSD that had followed him home from the desert was a nocturnal creature. It lived in the quiet hours. He sat in the darkened waiting room, staring at a poster about heartworm prevention, his leg bouncing nervously. Every time a car drove past outside, he flinched. At 2 a.m., the sound started. It came from the kennel area in the back, a metallic crashing, a high-pitched, frantic yelping that sounded like a soul being torn in half. Elias was on his feet before he was fully awake. He burst through the double doors, ignoring the staff-only sign. In the recovery ward, inside a large stainless steel cage, Valkyrie was losing her mind. The sedation had worn off. She had woken up in the dark, in a box. For a dog that had likely spent her entire life trapped in a crate, surrounded by filth and darkness, the cage wasn't a hospital. It was the torture chamber all over again. She was thrashing, throwing her body against the steel bars. Her claws scrabbled on the metal floor, a sound like screeching chalk. She was biting the wire mesh, blood starting to smear on the door. "Hey! Hey!" Elias shouted, running to the cage. Valkyrie didn't hear him. She was in the grip of a panic attack so severe she was effectively blind again. She snarled, snapping at the air, foaming at the mouth. Dr. Sarah rushed in behind him, a syringe in her hand. "I need to sedate her again. She's going to rip her stitches." "No," Elias blocked her arm. "No more needles. She's scared, Doc. She thinks she's back there." "She's hurting herself, Elias. Move." "Give me a minute," Elias commanded. It wasn't a request. He didn't open the cage. That would be suicide. Instead, he sat down on the cold tote floor, right in front of the kennel door. He turned his back to the cage, exposing his neck, a signal of ultimate trust. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, fighting his own rising panic. The noise of the cage rattling triggered memories of the transport helicopters, the shaking metal, the chaos. He needed to ground himself. He started to hum. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was the tune that lived in his marrow, the Marine's hymn, from the halls of Montezuma. He hummed it low and deep, a baritone vibration that cut through the high-pitched yelps. To the shores of Tripoli. He slowed the tempo down. He turned a marching song into a lullaby. Inside the cage, the thrashing paused for a second. Valkyrie slammed into the door, panting heavily, her nose pressing against the grate, inches from Elias's back. "We fight our country's battles," Elias sang softly, the words rumbling in his chest. "In the air, on land, and sea." He kept the rhythm steady, like a heartbeat. He didn't move. He didn't look at her. He just offered his presence as an anchor in her storm. "I'm here, Valkyrie," he said between verses, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "I'm right here. The door is locked, but I'm on guard. No one comes in. No one takes you." The scrabbling stopped. The snarling faded into a low, confused whine. Elias felt hot breath on the back of his neck through the wire mesh. She was sniffing him. She was checking if the anchor was real. "First to fight for right and freedom," Elias murmured, tears leaking from his closed eyes, "and to keep our honor clean." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the tension left the room. Behind him, he heard the heavy thump of a dog's body sliding down the metal wall. Then, a long, shuddering exhale. Sarah, standing in the doorway with the syringe still in her hand, lowered her arm. She watched the big man sitting on the floor, singing to a broken dog. She saw the scars on his soul, reaching out to touch the scars on the dog's skin. Elias stayed there. He didn't get up. He kept humming, looping the song over and over until his own demons settled down, until the rhythm of Valkyrie's breathing matched his own. He fell asleep like that, sitting up against the cage, guarding the perimeter of her dreams. The morning sun struggled to pierce the overcast sky, casting a flat, diffuse light over the veterinary clinic's parking lot. Elias stood by his truck, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, watching a black unmarked sedan pull up. Detective Frank Miller stepped out, groaning as his knees took his weight. Miller was a man shaped by 30 years of police work in a rainy city. Eroded, cynical, but solid as bedrock. He wore a rumpled trench coat that seemed permanently damp, and his face was a map of broken capillaries and deep-set worry lines. He held a handheld RFID scanner like a weapon. "You look like hell, Elias," Miller grunted, shaking his friend's hand. His grip was firm, despite the arthritis. "Long night," Elias replied, his voice raspy. "Did you run the chip?" "We did. It was a mess," Miller said, leaning against the hood of the F-150. "Whoever took her tried to gouge it out. Slice wound on her left shoulder? That wasn't an accident. They tried to cut the ID out, but they missed the transponder coil by a millimeter." Elias felt a surge of cold fury. "Amateurs, or sadists. Both," Miller agreed. "Technician managed to pull a partial sequence. We cross-referenced it with the lost pet database from 3 years ago. We got a hit." Miller pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Elias. It was a printout of a missing animal report, dated 23 months ago. The photo showed a younger, fuller German shepherd, her coat glossy and black and tan, sitting proudly in a harness. "Her name isn't Valkyrie," Miller said softly. "It's Duchess." Elias stared at the photo. The eyes were the same, intelligent, soulful, but without the haunted shadow that now darkened them. "Owner?" Elias asked. "Clara Vance, 82 years old, former concert pianist. She lives at the Whispering Pines assisted living facility in Shoreline. She reported Duchess stolen during a home invasion. Whispering Pines smelled of lavender disinfectant and old paper." Elias walked down the hallway, feeling oversized and clumsy in the delicate environment. He found room 314 at the end of the hall. Clara Vance sat in a wingback chair facing a window she couldn't see. She was a bird-like woman, frail and translucent, her hands resting on her lap. Those hands, Elias noticed, were long-fingered and elegant, constantly moving in small, rhythmic twitches, as if playing a silent sonata on an invisible keyboard. "Mrs. Vance?" Elias asked gently from the doorway. Clara's head snapped up. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, milky white orbs that stared unseeingly past his left shoulder. "That voice," she said, her tone trembling. "You're not a nurse. You sound heavy, like a piano falling downstairs." Elias stepped inside, taking off his cap. "My name is Elias Thorne, ma'am. I'm a friend of Detective Miller." Clara's hands stilled instantly. She gripped about the arms of her chair. "Miller, did they find the men? The ones who broke in?" "No, ma'am, not yet." Elias hesitated. He pulled a chair close and sat down, leaning forward so she could sense his proximity. "We found Duchess." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, a crow cawed, harsh and mocking. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cheer. She let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. "Is she—" Clara couldn't finish the sentence. "She's alive," Elias said quickly. "She's at a clinic. She's hurt, Clara. She's been hurt bad, but she's alive." 2 years, Clara whispered, tears spilling from her sightless eyes. "They took my eyes when they took her, Mr. Thorne. I haven't left this room in 2 years because she was my courage. They broke into my house, pushed me down. I heard her fighting them. She fought so hard." "She's still fighting," Elias said. "She saved a puppy yesterday. She shielded him on the freeway with her own body." Clara smiled through her tears, a heartbreaking expression of pride and grief. "That's my Duchess, always protecting the weak, even when she's lost." She reached out blindly, and Elias took her hand. Her skin was like parchment paper. "Bring her to me?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "Can I smell her? Can I touch her ears?" Elias looked at the frail woman and then at the small, sterile room. He thought of Valkyrie in the cage, thrashing at the sound of a door closing. He thought of the long road to recovery, the medical bills, the potential for aggression. "Mrs. Vance," Elias said, his voice thick with difficulty. She's not the same dog you lost. She's terrified of loud noises. She needs surgeries. She needs 24-hour care. Clara squeezed his hand, surprisingly strong. She lowered her head. And I am an old woman who can barely walk to the dining hall. I can't care for her, can I? I don't think so, Elias admitted gently. Not right now. Clara nodded slowly, accepting the cruelty of time and circumstance. She took a deep breath and sat up straighter, regaining a shred of her former dignity. Mr. Thorne, she said, you found her. You saved her. Detective Miller told me on the phone that you stayed up all night with her. She needed a guard, Elias murmured. She needs a handler, Clara corrected. She was trained as a service dog. She needs a job. She needs a leader. If I take her back, we will both just be two broken things waiting to die in the dark. She turned her face toward him, her blind eyes piercing him more deeply than any sighted gaze could. You are a soldier, aren't you? I can hear it in your cadence. I was, Elias said. Then I am giving you a new mission, Clara said, her voice firm. You keep her. You be her eyes now. You be her courage. Promise me. Elias swallowed the lump in his throat. I promise, Clara. I'll take care of her. Good, she whispered, releasing his hand. Tell her she was a good girl. Tell her she can rest now. Elias left the nursing home, feeling heavier than when he arrived. He drove back to the clinic, the promise weighing on him like a fully loaded rucksack. He wasn't just fostering a dog anymore. He was inheriting a legacy. When he arrived at the vet, Sarah met him in the lobby. She looked grim. We have something else, she said. The police tech guy left this for you. He bagged it as evidence, but he said you might know what it is. She handed him a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was the strip of black fabric that had been taped over Valkyrie's eyes. Elias took the bag. He walked over to the window, examining it in the gray light. It wasn't just a rag. It was heavy-duty canvas, the kind used for industrial tarps or machinery covers. The edges were frayed, but the weave was tight, waterproof. He opened the bag slightly. The smell hit him instantly. It wasn't the smell of a household garage. It was a sharp, acrid chemical scent. A mixture of sulfur, stale coolant, and old iron. Cutting fluid. Specifically, a type of synthetic coolant used in heavy lathe machinery. Elias closed his eyes and inhaled. The scent transported him back 10 years. He was working a graveyard shift as a security guard right after his discharge, trying to pay the mortgage while Sarah was sick. He remembered the long, echoing halls of the manufacturing plants. He opened his eyes and looked closer at the fabric. Faintly, almost invisible against the grease stains, was a partial white logo stamped on the canvas. It was a jagged gear shape with the letters TAC-IND barely legible inside. Tacoma Industrial, Elias whispered. What? Sarah asked. It's a defunct shipyard complex down in the Tide Flats, Elias said, his mind racing. Tacoma Industrial Supply. They went bankrupt 5 years ago. The whole sector is a ghost town. Just empty warehouses and rusting cranes. He looked at the blindfold again. The fabric was relatively new, despite the grease. Someone was using those abandoned warehouses. Someone who needed soundproofing. Someone who needed a place where barking dogs wouldn't be heard over the noise of the nearby port traffic. The chip was cut out, Elias muttered, piecing it together. Because they knew she was stolen property. They kept her for 2 years, breeding her until she dried up. Then, when she was useless, they dumped her on the I-5, Sarah finished, her face pale. No, Elias said, his voice cold. They didn't just dump her. They blinded her with this specific rag. They used what was lying around the shop. He handed the bag back to Sarah, his movement stiff and precise. Call Miller, Elias said, walking toward the door. Tell him I know where the nest is. Where are you going? Sarah called out. Elias stopped at the door. He turned back, and the look in his eyes made Sarah take a step back. It wasn't the look of a rescuer anymore. It was the look of a hunter. I'm going to do some reconnaissance, Elias said. Valkyrie can't see them, but I can. The Tacoma Tide Flats was a graveyard of industry, a sprawling expanse of concrete and rusted iron where the city dumped its bad dreams. Here, the fog didn't just roll in, it seeped up from the ground, smelling of brine, creosote, and secrets. Elias Thorne parked his Ford F-150  2 miles away, in a lot filled with the husks of abandoned commuter cars. He didn't look like a vigilante. He looked like an old man going for a walk in the rain, wearing a nondescript gray poncho that rendered him invisible against the slate-colored sky. But, under the poncho, his mind was sharpening into a weapon he hadn't unsheathed in years. He moved on foot, keeping to the shadows of the shipping containers stacked like colorful monoliths against the gray horizon. His bad knee ached with the damp cold, a rhythmic throb that served as a metronome for his march. He wasn't Elias the widower today. He was Sergeant Thorne, Force Recon, United States Marine Corps, and he was hunting. He found his observation post, an OP, in the skeletal remains of a grain silo overlooking the Tacoma Industrial Supply Complex. It was high, dry, and offered a commanding view of the target. Elias settled into the dust. He pulled out a pair of Steiner military-grade binoculars, the rubber coating worn smooth by years of use. He adjusted the focus. The world jumped closer. The warehouse was a fortress of corrugated metal. The windows were painted black. To the average passerby, it was just another dead building in a dying district. But Elias saw the signs of life, the fresh tire tracks in the mud, the heat shimmer rising from a ventilation vent on the roof, suggesting heavy climate control inside, and the silence. It was too quiet, a silence that felt manufactured. Elias didn't move. He didn't fidget. He became part of the architecture. The first rule of recon: you are a rock, you are a shadow, you do not exist. For 12 hours he watched. The rain drummed against the metal roof above him, a lonely, persistent rhythm. In the solitude, Elias's mind drifted back to the sanctuary of the veterinary clinic, to the warmth he had felt just that morning. He had gone to check on Scout before driving down here. The puppy was out of the incubator, sitting in a small playpen lined with soft towels. When Elias had walked in, the transformation was immediate. Scout, who had been cowering in the corner, lifted his head. His oversized ears, one flopped over and one standing at attention, twitched. He let out a sharp, joyful yip, a sound like a squeaky toy being stepped on. Elias had opened the gate, and the puppy had stumbled toward him. His legs were still weak, his coordination laughable. He walked like a drunk sailor, paws sliding on the linoleum. But he didn't stop until he collapsed onto Elias's boot, wrapping his front paws around the leather ankle. "Careful there, little man," Elias had rumbled, reaching down to scoop him up. Scout immediately burrowed into Elias's jacket, seeking the heartbeat he remembered from the truck. He didn't want food. He didn't want toys. He wanted Elias. One of the vet techs, a young woman named Jenny with bright pink hair, had smiled as she refilled water bowls. "He's imprinting on you, you know," she said. "To him, you're not the guy who found him. You're the mom." Elias had grunted, embarrassed. "I'm just the ride home." "No," Jenny said softly. "Look at him. He feels safe. That's not just a ride. That's a parent." Elias looked down at the sleeping puppy in his arms. He felt a strange, terrifying expansion in his chest. For 3 years, his heart had been a closed room, dusty and dark. Now, this tiny broken creature was kicking the door down. It wasn't just a duty anymore. It wasn't just about paying a debt to a brave mother dog. It was love. The terrifying, inconvenient, life-altering kind of love. Snap. The sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut in the distance pulled Elias back to the present. The memory of the warm puppy vanished, replaced by the cold steel of the tide flats. It was 200 hours. The witching hour. Below him, the yard of the warehouse came alive. A white panel van, muddy and dented, rolled through the chain-link gate. The headlights were off. The driver navigated by the ambient glow of the distant port lights. Elias adjusted his binoculars. He held his breath. The van backed up to the loading dock. 2 men jumped out. They were dressed in dark hoodies, moving with the hurried aggression of people who knew they were doing something wrong. They threw the back doors of the van open. Elias watched, his hands tightening on the binoculars until his knuckles turned white. They started unloading crates. Small plastic travel crates. They weren't handling them like cargo. They were throwing them. One man grabbed a crate by the wire door and swung it onto the concrete dock. Even from 300 yards away, Elias saw the crate shake. He saw the terrified face of a French bulldog press against the grate. Then came the bigger cages. These were dragged. Inside one, a pit bull lunged at the bars, not in aggression, but in panic. The man kicked the cage, shouting something lost to the wind. Then, a third man stepped out of the warehouse. He was different. He didn't carry crates. He stood with his hands in the pockets of a thick leather jacket, smoking a cigarette. He was huge, with a shaved head and a neck that disappeared into his shoulders. He walked with a limp, a distinct heavy drag of the left leg. He pointed at the dogs, barking orders. He looked at the animals not with hatred, but with total, chilling indifference, like they were boxes of expired fruit. "Got you," Elias whispered. "Target acquired." Elias didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for his notebook. He began to draw. His pen moved with precise, practiced strokes. He sketched the layout of the yard. He marked the blind spots where the security cameras didn't sweep. He noted the heavy padlock on the south gate and the rusted hinges on the side door. 3 hostiles visible, 1 leader, 2 muscle, unarmed, but likely carrying concealed blades or blunt instruments. Entry point Alpha, main dock, 2 exposed. Entry point Bravo, fire door, east wall. Obstructed by pallets, but breachable. Asset location, north sector of the warehouse. Ventilation indicates holding area. He watched for another hour, noting the license plate of the van as it pulled away. He noted the rotation of the single security guard who walked the perimeter every 45 minutes, staring at his phone, bored and complacent. By the time the sun began to bleed a bruise-colored light over the horizon, Elias had everything. He didn't just have a location, he had a battle plan. He packed his gear silently. He took one last look at the fortress of misery below. "Sleep well, boys," Elias murmured to the men in the warehouse, "because the storm is coming." The diner was located near the precinct, a place that smelled of bacon grease and stale coffee. Detective Miller slid into the booth opposite Elias. He looked tired, but when Elias slid the manila envelope across the table, his eyes sharpened. "Tell me you didn't go inside, Elias," Miller warned, opening the envelope. "I observed," Elias said, taking a sip of black coffee. From a distance. Miller pulled out the papers. He stopped. He wasn't looking at scribbles on a napkin. He was looking at a professional intelligence dossier. There was a top-down map drawn to scale. There were timestamps of vehicle movements. There were descriptions of the suspects, down to the brand of cigarettes the leader smoked. There was an analysis of the building's structural weaknesses. Miller looked up, a mixture of awe and concern on his face. "Jesus, Elias, this isn't a tip. This is an invasion plan." "It's a target package," Elias corrected gently. "That building is a fire trap, Frank. The ventilation is rigged. If they panic and try to torch the place to destroy evidence, those dogs die in minutes. You can't just knock on the front door." He pointed to a spot on the map marked with a red X. "The side door. The hinges are rusted. A battering ram will take it in one hit. It puts your team directly between the suspects and the holding pens. You cut off their access to the animals." Miller stared at the map. He traced the lines with his finger. "You identified the leader? The guy with the limp?" "I did," Elias said. "Moves like he took shrapnel in the hip. Or maybe a bad fall. He's the one giving orders. The butcher." Miller sighed, rubbing his face. With the license plate number and the witness testimony from the vet, I can get a warrant, a no-knock warrant." "Do it," Elias said. "Tonight." "You know I can't let you lead the charge, Elias," Miller said softly. "You're a civilian now." Elias looked out the window, at the rain streaking the glass. He thought of Scout stumbling into his arms. He thought of Valkyrie trembling in the dark. "I don't need to lead," Elias said. "I just need to know they're coming out alive." Miller nodded. He tapped the dossier on the table. "You did good work, Sergeant. Go home. Get some sleep. We'll take it from here." Elias stood up. He put his hat on, pulling the brim low. "I'll sleep when they're safe," he said. He walked out into the rain, leaving the blueprint for justice on the table. The rain had turned into a cold, persistent drizzle that slicked the asphalt and muffled the world in a shroud of gray static. Elias Thorne stood in the tree line behind the Tacoma Industrial Complex, merged with the darkness of the wet Douglas firs. He was a ghost again, a silent sentinel watching the back door of hell. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wore his heavy canvas field jacket, the collar turned up against the chill, and a pair of thick leather work gloves. He had no badge, no gun. His weapon was patience, honed over decades of waiting for the enemy to make a mistake. Through the earpiece of the police scanner, he had tuned to the tactical frequency. Elias heard the clipped, sterile voices of the SWAT team stacking up at the front entrance. "Alpha team in position. Breaching in 3, 2, 1, Boom! The sound of the flashbang grenade was dull and thudding from this side of the building, like a heavy book dropped in a library. But the reaction was instant. The warehouse erupted. Even through the corrugated metal walls, Elias could hear the shouting, "Police! Search warrant! Get on the ground!" and the terrified barking of 100 dogs. It was a cacophony of chaos, the sound of a hive kicked over. Elias didn't flinch toward the noise. He kept his eyes locked on the rusted metal fire door 50 yards away, half hidden behind a stack of rotting pallets. He knew men like the butcher. Rats don't run toward the light, they run for the holes. Inside, the operation was disintegrating into a frenzy. The radio chatter grew frantic. "Suspects are releasing the animals. I repeat, dogs are loose in the hallway. Watch your fire. They're using them as shields. We have aggressive canines in the fatal funnel." Elias clenched his jaw. Of course they were. Cowards always hid behind the innocent. He imagined the scene. Terrified dogs, pumped full of adrenaline and fear, turned into weapons against men with rifles. It was a massacre waiting to happen. Then, the metal door in front of Elias groaned. It burst open with a screech of rusted hinges. A man stumbled out into the muddy yard. It was him, the butcher. He was huge, a mountain of flesh in a grease-stained leather jacket, dragging his bad leg through the mud. In one hand, he clutched a plastic crate so tightly, the handle bowed. Inside, 4 French bulldog puppies tumbled over each other, white balls of fluff worth thousands on the black market. He wasn't alone. Attached to a thick chain wrapped around his other wrist was a monster. It was a pit bull, massive and slate gray, with cropped ears that sat like jagged ruins on its blocky head. The dog was foaming at the mouth, eyes rolling wild and white, the unmistakable sign of amphetamines. It wasn't a dog anymore. It was a loaded gun with the safety off. The butcher saw the police lights reflecting off the wet pavement at the front of the building. He turned, looking toward the woods, toward freedom, toward Elias. Elias stepped out from the tree line. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just stepped into the open, a solid, immovable object in the path of the escape. The butcher froze. He saw the old man blocking his way. A sneer twisted his face. He didn't see a Marine. He saw a speed bump. "Get out of the way, old man!" The butcher roared. He unclipped the chain. "Kill!" he screamed, pointing at Elias. "Kill him!" The pit bull launched. It was a blur of gray muscle and teeth, propelled by drugs and a lifetime of conditioned violence. It covered the distance in seconds, a silent missile aimed at Elias's throat. Time slowed down. The fog of war that usually confused men became crystal clear for Elias. He didn't feel fear. He felt the cold, hard click of muscle memory engaging. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget: protect the vitals, offer the sacrifice. Elias didn't reach for a weapon. He stripped off his heavy canvas jacket in one fluid motion, wrapping it thick and tight around his left forearm. He dropped his center of gravity, bending his knees, turning his body sideways. He didn't retreat. He stepped into the attack. When the dog leaped, jaws gaping wide to crush bone, Elias drove his wrapped left arm straight into the animal's mouth. Thud. The impact was like catching a swinging sledgehammer. The dog's jaws clamped down on the thick canvas. Even through the layers of fabric and leather, Elias felt the crushing pressure, the bruising force that threatened to snap his radius. Pain shot up his shoulder, hot and electric. But the dog had taken the bait. It was latched onto the arm, thrashing, trying to tear and shake. Elias didn't pull away. Pulling away meant shredded flesh. He pushed in, jamming his arm deeper into the dog's mouth, gagging it, neutralizing the leverage of the bite. With his free right hand, Elias moved with surgical precision. He grabbed the loose skin at the back of the dog's neck, the scruff, and twisted. At the same time, he used his legs to sweep the dog's hindquarters out from under it. It was a takedown maneuver he had used on insurgents, adapted for a 4-legged combatant. He slammed the dog into the mud. "Down!" Elias roared, his voice cracking like a whip. He pinned the animal to the ground, using his body weight to control its hips while keeping his arm fed into the bite. The dog thrashed, eyes wild, but Elias was heavy and he was calm. He wasn't hurting the dog, he was holding it. "I've got you," Elias grunted, sweat mixing with the rain on his face. "I've got you, son. It's over." The butcher watched in disbelief. His weapon had been neutralized in seconds, not with a bullet, but with bare hands. Panic took over. The criminal dropped the crate of puppies and turned to run back toward the building, seeking another exit. "Miller!" Elias shouted, his voice booming. "Back door!" As if summoned, Detective Miller and 2 SWAT officers rounded the corner of the building, weapons drawn. "Police, don't move!" The butcher raised his hands, defeated, sliding to his knees in the mud. But Elias didn't look at the arrest. His entire world was the gray dog beneath him. The drugs were still coursing through the animal's veins, making its heart hammer against Elias's chest like a trapped bird. The dog was still trying to growl, but the sound was muffled by the jacket. "Easy," Elias whispered, his face inches from the dog's ear. "You're not a killer. You're just a soldier following bad orders. I know. He kept his weight steady, broadcasting calm into the frantic creature. He waited. He waited for the adrenaline to spike and fall. He waited for the realization that no pain was coming. Slowly, the crushing pressure on his arm lessened. The dog's jaw went slack. The wild rolling of the eyes stopped, replaced by a confused, exhausted stare. Elias gently extricated his arm from the dog's mouth. The canvas jacket was shredded, ruined. His forearm underneath was turning a dark, angry purple, but the skin wasn't broken. He didn't let the dog up. He moved his hand to the dog's chest, rubbing soothing circles. "That's a good boy," Elias murmured. "You're done fighting. You're honorably discharged." The pit bull let out a long, shuddering sigh and rested its heavy head in the mud. It closed its eyes, surrendering not to force, but to peace. Detective Miller walked over, his gun holstered now. He looked at the massive dog pinned beneath his friend, and then at the shredded jacket. "You okay, Elias?" Miller asked, his voice tight. Elias looked up. The rain washed the mud from his face. He looked tired, older than his years, but his eyes were clear. "We're both okay," Elias said. He just needed someone to stop him. Miller looked at the crate of puppies sitting safely in the grass, then at the handcuffed butcher being led away. "You called it, Elias," Miller said, shaking his head. "You called the whole damn play." "The crate," Elias pointed. "Get them inside. Warm them up." As the officers moved to secure the scene, Elias stayed in the mud. He didn't want to leave the gray dog alone until the animal control officers arrived with a stretcher. He stroked the velvet ears, shielding the animal's eyes from the flashing blue lights of the cruisers. "Semper Fi," Elias whispered to the fallen warrior. "Always faithful, even when they don't deserve it." The waiting room of the King County Animal Control Center was a purgatory painted in shades of institutional beige. It smelled of bleach, wet fur, and the lingering metallic scent of decisions made by people who didn't have to look into the eyes of the condemned. Elias Thorne sat on a plastic chair that groaned under his weight. He was wearing his Sunday best, a charcoal suit that hadn't seen the light of day since Sarah's funeral. It was tight in the shoulders and smelled faintly of mothballs and cedar. His hands, resting on his knees, were scarred and calloused, tremors of nervous energy vibrating beneath the skin. He wasn't here to adopt a pet. He was here to plead for a life. 3 weeks had passed since the raid on the Tacoma warehouse. The butcher was behind bars, awaiting trial. The puppies, including Scout, were in foster care, recovering rapidly with the resilience of youth. But Valkyrie was different. She was housed in the Red Zone, the high-security wing reserved for animals deemed a threat to public safety. Her file, a thick folder resting on the table inside the conference room, was stamped with a single, damning word: unadoptable. The door opened. A young administrative assistant, looking terrified of Elias's stony expression, beckoned him in. "The review board is ready for you, Mr. Thorne." Elias stood up. His bad knee clicked, a sound like a pistol cocking in the silence. He walked into the room. 3 people sat behind a long laminate table. To the left was Mrs. Halloway, the shelter director, a woman with kind eyes but a mouth hardened by years of putting animals to sleep. To the right was Dr. Aries, a behavioral specialist with a clipboard and a demeanor as cold as a stethoscope. In the middle sat a city attorney, checking his watch. "Please sit," Mrs. Halloway said. Elias remained standing. "I prefer to stand, ma'am." Dr. Aris adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Thorne, we appreciate what you did during the raid, truly, but we are here to discuss the German Shepherd, ID number 8940. You call her Valkyrie." "That is her name," Elias said. "According to our assessment," Dr. Aris tapped yet the file, Valkyrie displays severe barrier aggression, resource guarding, and extreme distrust of strangers. She has lunged at 3 staff members. She is a weaponized animal, Mr. Thorne. She was trained to kill, then abused until she became paranoid. She is a loaded gun with a hair trigger. She was protecting her young, Elias said, his voice low and steady. And then she was protecting herself. You put a prisoner of war in a cage and poke him with sticks, he's going to fight back. That's not aggression. That's survival. It's liability, the city attorney interjected, bored. The city cannot release a dangerous animal to a private citizen, especially, he flipped through a stack of papers, especially to a citizen with your profile. Elias stiffened. My profile? You are 55. You live alone. You have no support network. The attorney looked up, locking eyes with Elias. And your VA medical records indicate a history of severe PTSD, insomnia, hypervigilance, anger management issues. The room went silent. The air felt thin. You are asking to take a traumatized, violent animal into a home that is already unstable, Dr. Aris said, softening his tone slightly. We are concerned that her aggression will trigger your trauma, or vice versa. It is a recipe for disaster. Compassion is not enough, Mr. Thorne. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is give them peace. Peace, a euphemism for a needle and a black bag. Elias looked at them. He saw good people trapped in a system of boxes and checkboxes. They saw a broken man and a broken dog, and their math said 2 negatives made a disaster. They didn't understand the alchemy of survival. You think we're broken? Elias said quietly. You look at my scars, and you look at hers, and you see damage, but you're wrong. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. You learn things in the dark that you can't learn in the light. She doesn't need a soft touch. She doesn't need a treat. She needs a lieutenant. She needs someone who knows that the war never really ends. It just changes location. He looked at Mrs. Halloway. Let me see her. Let me show you. Mrs. Halloway hesitated. She looked at the file, then at the desperate conviction in the old soldier's eyes. The temperament test is scheduled for now, she said slowly. We were going to conduct it without you. But if you think you can control her, we will allow you to observe from behind the glass. No glass, Elias said. In the room. That is against protocol, the attorney snapped. If I'm wrong, Elias said, you can put us both down. The assessment room was a large concrete enclosure with high windows. Valkyrie was brought in by a handler using a catch pole, a long rod with a loop around her neck, keeping her at a safe distance. She looked terrible. Her coat was dull, her eyes darting frantically. The muzzle on her snout was tight, cutting into her fur. She was panting, a high-pitched, stressed rasp. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, ready to snap. Dr. Aris and the board stood on the observation deck above. Elias stood by the door on the ground floor, waiting. Begin the pressure test, Dr. Aris ordered over the intercom. A second handler entered the room. He was dressed in a padded suit, carrying a baton. He wasn't hitting her, but he was posturing, stomping his feet, raising the stick, making direct eye contact. It was a simulation of a threat, a test to see if the dog would retreat or engage. Valkyrie didn't retreat. She exploded. She threw herself at the end of the catch pole, snarling so viciously that saliva flew from the muzzle. Her bark was a deafening roar, deep and guttural. She was trying to kill the man in the padded suit. She was a creature of pure distilled rage. See? Dr. Aris's voice came over the speaker, tinged with regret. She is escalating. She has no off switch. This is a red zone dog. Terminate the test. Prepare for... Open the door, Elias said to the guard next to him. The guard shook his head. Sir, she's crazy. She'll tear you apart. Elias didn't wait. He reached over, punched the release button, and shoved the heavy steel door open. He stepped into the kill zone. The sound in the room was overwhelming. The barking, the shouting of the handlers, the echoing acoustics. Valkyrie was mid-lunge, fighting the pole, her eyes rolling back in her head. She didn't see Elias. She only saw threats. She saw the demons of the warehouse, the shadows of the men who had blinded her. Elias walked to the center of the room. He didn't run. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic cadence. He stopped 10 feet away from the chaotic swirl of fur and teeth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clap his hands. He simply stood up straight. He pulled his shoulders back, expanding his chest. He radiated a calm so profound it felt like a drop in temperature. "Valkyrie," he said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a command frequency, low, resonant, the voice of a pack leader. "Stand down!" It happened in a heartbeat. The sound of his voice cut through the red haze in the dog's mind like a sniper's bullet. Valkyrie froze midair, landing awkwardly on her paws. She spun around, the catch pole rattling. She looked at the man in the charcoal suit. She blinked. The wildness in her eyes receded, replaced by recognition. The handler with the pole braced himself, expecting her to redirect the attack onto the new target. But Valkyrie didn't attack. She lowered her head. Her ears, previously pinned back in fury, flicked forward. Her tail gave a single, hesitant wag. "Heel," Elias said softly, tapping his left leg. The handlers watched in disbelief as the unadoptable monster trotted over to Elias. She ignored the man with the stick. She ignored the catch pole still around her neck. She came to Elias's left side, the tactical position. She sat down. She pressed her shoulder against his leg, looking up at him, waiting for the next order. Elias reached down. He didn't flinch. He unbuckled the muzzle. The handlers gasped. Valkyrie shook her head, freeing her snout. She looked at Elias's hand. She could have bitten it off. Instead, she licked his palm, a long, wet rasp of apology and gratitude. Elias rested his hand on her head, scratching behind her ears. He looked up at the observation window, at the stunned faces of the board members. "She's not broken," Elias called out, his voice echoing in the silent room. "She was just waiting for orders." He looked down at the dog. "We're done here, girl. Let's go get your boy." The house on the edge of the Snoqualmie woods had been silent for 3 years. It was a silence that had weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from dust motes and memories. Elias Thorne had lived inside it like a ghost haunting his own life, moving from room to room without disturbing the air. But today, the silence was shattered. It broke with the scrabble of claws on hardwood floors. It broke with the squeak of a rubber toy being murdered with enthusiasm. It broke with the heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a tail hitting the wall. Elias stood in the doorway of his living room, holding a cardboard box filled with dog supplies. He watched the chaos unfold, and for the first time in a long time, the corners of his mouth twitched upward. Scout, now a lanky adolescent pup with paws too big for his body, was currently engaged in a tactical operation against the rug. He growled playfully, tugging at the fringe, his ears flopping wildly. Valkyrie stood by the fireplace. She wasn't playing, she was working. She moved through the house with the precision of a site survey team, checking every window, sniffing every door jamb. She was mapping the perimeter. When she finished her circuit, she trotted over to Elias, sat by his left leg, and looked up. "Sector secure," her eyes seemed to say. "What are the standing orders?" "Orders are to relax, Sergeant," Elias murmured, setting the box down. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tennis ball. He tossed it gently. Valkyrie watched it bounce. She didn't chase it. She looked at Scout, who scrambled over, tripped on his own feet, and pounced on the ball. Valkyrie let out a soft huff, a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, and laid down, resting her chin on her paws. She was content to watch the rookie train. Elias walked to the kitchen to make coffee. As the machine hissed and gurgled, he looked out the window. The fog was gone. The sky was a crisp, brilliant winter blue, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to drift down, dusting the pines and sugar. It was December 23rd. In previous years, Elias would have closed the curtains. He would have ignored the calendar, treating Christmas like any other Tuesday. But this year, there was a wreath on the door. It was crooked, and it was store-bought, but it was there. "Load up," Elias called out, grabbing his keys. "We have a mission." Valkyrie was at the door before the keys finished jingling. Scout abandoned the rug, skidding into the hallway. The drive to Shoreline was quiet, the tires crunching on the fresh snow. Elias glanced in the rearview mirror. Scout was asleep, upside down, legs twitching in a dream chase. Valkyrie sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the world pass by, her ears swiveling to track the cars. She wasn't anxious anymore. She was alert, yes, but the frantic terror of the blindfold was gone. She trusted the man at the wheel. When they pulled into the Whispering Pines assisted living facility, the nurses waved. They knew Elias now. He had visited Clara Vance every Sunday for the past month, giving her updates, but he had never brought the dogs, until today. Clara was waiting in the solarium, a warm room filled with plants that smelled of damp earth and life. She was wearing a red cardigan, her silver hair neatly pinned. "They're here," Clara said before Elias even opened the glass door. "I can feel the air change." Elias walked in, signaling Valkyrie to heel. "You have radar ears, Clara." "I have a heart that remembers," she corrected softly. She held out her hands, fingers trembling slightly. "Is she—" "Go say hi," Elias whispered to Valkyrie. The German shepherd moved forward. She didn't jump, she didn't bark. She seemed to understand the fragility of the woman in the chair. She approached slowly, her tail wagging in a low, gentle sweep. Valkyrie stopped inches from Clara's knees. She stretched her neck out and nudged Clara's hand with her cold, wet nose. Clara gasped. Her hands flew to the dog's face, tracing the slope of the muzzle, the velvet softness of the ears, the thick fur of the neck. "Duchess," Clara whispered, tears leaking from her sightless eyes. "Oh, my beautiful Duchess." Valkyrie closed her eyes. She leaned into the touch, letting out a long, contented groan. She remembered this scent. She remembered the piano music and the soft hands. This was her past. This was a good chapter. "She looks wonderful," Clara said, her fingers reading the dog's condition like Braille. "She's filled out. Her coat is strong, and—" She paused, her hand resting over Valkyrie's heart. "Her heartbeat is slow. She is safe." "She's the boss of the house," Elias said, his voice thick. "Runs a tight ship." "And the little one?" Elias nudged Scout forward. The puppy was less dignified. He wiggled his entire body, licking Clara's hand enthusiastically. Clara laughed, a bright, chiming sound that made the nurses turn and smile. "Oh, he has spirit," Clara delighted, scratching Scout's belly. "He's a spark plug." They stayed for an hour. They talked about the snow, about the trial date for the men who had done this. Clara promised to be there, to testify about the theft, and about the future. When it was time to leave, the moment hung heavy in the air. Valkyrie stood between them. She looked at Clara, then at Elias. She hesitated. Clara sensed it. She leaned forward and kissed the dog's forehead. "Go on," Clara whispered. "You have a new mission now, Duchess. You have to take care of the major here." "Sergeant," Elias corrected gently. "To me, you're a general," Clara smiled. She pulled her hands back, folding them in her lap. "Go. Take them home for Christmas, Elias, and thank you for giving me my goodbye." Valkyrie licked at Clara's cheek one last time, a final seal of affection, and then turned. She walked to Elias's side and sat down. She didn't look back. She had made her choice. Christmas Eve fell with a heavy silence, but it was the good kind of silence, the kind that comes with snow falling on a roof and a fire crackling in the hearth. The living room was warm, illuminated only by the orange glow of the embers and the small string of lights Elias had draped over the mantel. Elias sat in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't drinking it, he was just holding it, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. On the rug in front of the fire, Scout was sprawled out on his back, legs in the air, snoring softly. He was safe. He would never know the cold of a cage or the terror of a blindfold. He would only know warmth, full bowls, and the rough affection of an old soldier. Valkyrie lay closer to Elias's chair. Her head was up, resting on her paws, watching the flames. Elias looked up at the mantel. There, next to the small, sad wreath, was a framed photo of Sarah. She was laughing in the picture, her hair blown back by the wind on a ferry boat. For 3 years, Elias hadn't been able to look at that photo without feeling like he was bleeding. But tonight, he looked at it and smiled. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," he whispered. I think I'm doing okay." He looked down at Valkyrie. The dog turned her head, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were deep pools of amber, intelligent and knowing. She saw him. Not the widower, not the veteran, just the man. Elias set his glass down. He reached for his neck. His fingers found the cool metal chain he had worn every day for 30 years. The chain that held his identity, his blood type, his religion, and his history. He unclasped it. The dog tags jingled softly as he pulled them free. Thorn, Elias, USMC, 0321 Recon. He leaned forward. Valkyrie, front and center. The dog stood up immediately and stepped closer. She sat, her posture perfect. Elias held the tags up. They caught the firelight, spinning slowly. "I don't have a medal to give you," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "And you don't need a collar that marks you as property. You're not a pet. You're my partner." He reached around her neck, fastening the chain. It was loose, hanging low on her chest, the silver tags resting against her dark fur. "These say who I am," Elias whispered. "Now they say who we are." Valkyrie didn't shake them off. She looked down at the medal, then up at Elias. She stepped forward and rested her heavy head on his knee, letting out a long sigh that seemed to expel the last of the ghosts from the room. Elias buried his hands in her fur. He looked out the window, where the snow was covering the world in a clean white sheet. The fog was gone. The road ahead was clear. "Semper Fidelis," Elias whispered into the quiet room. Valkyrie closed her eyes, the metal tags warm against her heart, always faithful. The journey of Elias and Valkyrie reminds us that even when we feel lost in the fog of grief or loneliness, we are never truly alone. We often think that we are the ones doing the rescuing, but in reality, the acts of kindness we offer to others, whether to a person or an animal, are often the very things that save us. Healing does not mean forgetting the past. It means finding a purpose big enough to help us move forward. No one is too broken to be loved, and no one is too old to find a new mission. If this story of loyalty, courage, and redemption touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with a friend who might need a reminder that hope is always just around the corner. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that celebrates the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Now, I would like to take a moment to pray for you. Dear God, I ask that you watch over everyone listening to this story today. Please bring comfort to those who are grieving a loss and bring light to those who feel like they are walking through a heavy fog. Give us the strength to be guardians for the innocent and the courage to open our hearts again, even after they have been broken. Bless our homes with peace and our families with love. If you receive this blessing and agree with this prayer, please write Amen in the comments below. Stay strong and remember, Semper Fidelis, always faithful,